delighted to be here. I'm sorry Julia could not be here today, but we're in touch, and I appreciate her part in bringing me back here again. There are some familiar faces in the audience, so some of you were here last year. I'm not going to repeat what I was talking about last year. I'm going to give you the 2-minute summary of what The Millionaire and the Bard is about. Why is she here? And then I'm going to spend the rest of the talk essentially talking about what the first folio is, why it was important, and then really more about the process of printing the book, so that I can then show you on U.C. Irvine's own copy what I'm talking about, how the printing process affects what the final product of the book is. So this part of my talk last year, I talked about, for example, the watermarks on the paper. And at least 2 people have come up to me today and said they were interested in sort of these artifacts of how the book is printed. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that today. So the quick and dirty introduction to my book, The Millionaire and the Bard, the book is about what the first folio is, why it is important to English language literature, and a Gilded Age collector and his wife who wanted to own every known copy of the book. And it's a kind of a strange thing to be a collector, and you don't stop. And the books, you would think, are essentially the same. These copies of the book are essentially, so imagine if you go to a book auction, you buy a first edition signed of Jack London's Call of the Wild. Are you likely to want to buy 2 copies? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up to 82? Okay. And now we're not just talking about a Jack London first edition that is signed. We're talking about a first folio that the cheap copies are in the 100,000 range. And the expensive copy, the most expensive today, is $6.1 million. So we're talking about not something inexpensive, and part of the story is why the obsession with getting this gigantic collection, where the end of the story is that about 1/3 of the world's known copies of the first folio are all housed in one book, in one building, in one library, and that is the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. So that is what The Millionaire and the Bard is about. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking today about the plays. I'm really going to talk more about the actual physical book, because you have one here, and they said I can show it to you. Okay. So prior to Shakespeare's death, what had already been published were his long poems, his sonnets, although he had nothing to do with publishing either of them. And then 19 of the plays had been published in quarto form, which would be like a small paperback edition of a single play. You have in the collection room, you'll see a couple of quarto-sized books. But none of them were published with either the permission of or under the supervision of Shakespeare or anyone who had close ties to the theater who performed with him. And I went over that story last year. That's also in The Millionaire and the Bard if you want to read about that. But essentially, half of the plays had not been published by the time Shakespeare died, and it was actually very common in that era that we know of about twice as many plays as we actually have copies of. So we know mostly through diaries, in fact through 2 diaries. Went to the play today and I saw Christopher Marlowe's Edward II, and either we have a copy of it or we don't. We know about twice as many as we have copies of. So arguably the first folio saved half of the plays from extinction. And I'll talk a little bit about which ones they were. Some of them you might have heard of before, like Macbeth, and Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, and so on. Then enter these 2 unsung heroes of English language literature, and more about them in a minute. You're going to see that in the first folio as well, and John Hemings and Henry Condell. And before you tell me I spelled the names wrong, just wait, because they're spelled at least 2 ways just in the book alone. So there was really no standardization of spelling, and that actually leads to some, not even of names, not even of Shakespeare's name. So there is the Shakespeare Society picks out how do we spell Shakespeare, and now we all spell it that way. But even he signed his name different ways, and it was certainly spelled different ways while the books were being printed. So Hemings and Condell are fellow actors and mates of Shakespeare. So he hangs out with them in London. He performs and plays with them in 2 different companies. And then they're also business partners of his when the Globe Theatre eventually opens. And after Will Shakespeare dies, he leaves them money in his will to buy memorial rings to remember him. And they decide to remember him in a slightly different way. They collect the books that they had available to them that had already been published, copies of the plays had already been published, plus whatever manuscripts they might have had available to them as actors and as members of the, not only a theater company, but the theater company that Shakespeare was a shareholder in. And therefore they would have had access to at least the prompt copies. So they didn't leave behind a diary, dear diary, we use manuscripts, we use this, we use bills. We don't have evidence of that, but we can surmise what they might have had available to them, and that would have included the prompt copies that the theater would have owned. Not only that, they had acted in the plays. They had acted in the plays with Shakespeare as well as under his direction. So not only did they have the manuscripts or the prompt copies or the published versions of the plays available to them, but they knew how these had been performed. And therefore, we say that the first folio really probably comes closest to what Shakespeare actually intended with the plays and how they were actually performed at the time. So again, part of the story of the apotheosis of Shakespeare from a writer head and shoulders above his peers, but among some pretty amazing peers, to the secular god of English language literature, I don't know if I'm exaggerating that, is part of that story is how Shakespeare is performed over the centuries, and it changes. And there, for example, there's one impresario in London who says, well, maybe every other night Romeo and Juliet should have a happy ending. So if you're born at that time and you go to Drury Lane Theatre and you see Romeo and Juliet live happily ever after, maybe that's how you think the play originated. Well, we believe that the first folio really comes the closest that we can to what Shakespeare actually intended. This is a memorial in London to Hemings and Condell, and I reproduce that here because they are worthy of, well, if not worship, certainly of reverence, having put this project together. That's the plaque on the plate there. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how the folio is printed and what the process looked like. And the reason is, for everything that I'm going to talk about, I'm going to be able to show it to you in the first folio that you have right in front of the room. So the first question is, what's the format? You'll be able to see that the first folio is about 13 by 8 inches each page. Okay, so that's a very large volume. And prior to the publication of the first folio, that format really had been reserved for works with some gravitas, political tracts, religious tracts, and things that are essentially very important books. And plays, for various reasons, were not considered to be serious literature. Again, I covered that last year, and I covered it in The Millionaire and the Bard, if you're interested, why being a playwright was a few steps above prostitution, and therefore it was a little bit of a surprise that it was published in the folio format. So folio refers to the size of the page, and I've got a little demonstration here for you that's might be able to help. So imagine you have a piece of paper that goes into the printing press, and really what you're doing is you're printing 2 columns of text on each side of the page, and then 2 columns on the other side. Oops. 2 columns on the other side as well. Okay. And you fold that page only once. That is called a folio format. Okay, so the page is slightly bigger than this. 26 by 60. Okay. And then eventually what you're going to do is you're going to make 900 copies of this or 750 copies of this, and you stack them all up, and then you do the next page, and you have a stack of them, and you have another stack. At the end of the printing process, you've got these stacks of pages, and somebody has to collate them. Okay? The person who's collating them may or may not know how to read. And so you want to make sure that things go in the right order. There's an additional complication you might already have figured out, which is, let's say I want you to collate these. So essentially, I'm going to put notations on the bottom of the page. This is going to be A, this is going to be A2, this is going to be A3, and I want you to stack them in that order. Okay, so A, A2, A3, stack them up. Fold all the pages once. Now you have 6 pages of text in a little booklet called a quire. And you may have noticed that when I assemble them, let's say this is the first page 1, page 2, those are printed sequentially, but the next page is actually not the third page, right? So how do we do this? Printing these quires, by the time you get to the inside text of the third page, first, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you're on the 6th page, but it's not the 6th page that you printed or typeset. Everybody understand what the problem is? So on a computer, what do? You hit justify. And all the pages are but how do you do that if you're not printing the pages or setting them in order? And the answer is you start in the middle and you work your way out from each of the booklets. So you set this page first, then this one, then this one, then that one. Everybody understanding? This is a headache, right? So from the middle to the outsides, and then you hope you have exactly the right amount of text to have filled up those pages front and back. I'll show you what happens when you don't. Don't plan carefully. But a couple things. So one is, these little booklets are called quires, and it took about 2 years to print the first folio, so these little quires would have been hanging around the publisher's, the printer's shop for around 2 years. Booklet after booklet after booklet, and these are called quires in 6s because they're 3 pages, 6 leaves for each of them. And then you have the problem, well now you got a whole bunch of these little booklets lying around, right? You got A's, you got B's, so I don't want to put them all to be A's, we want them to be assembled separately. So the next group I'm going to label is B's, and I'm going to have a B1 and a B2, B3, and then C, and then D, and then E, and then F, and so on. Everybody get this? So that at the end of the day, I want you to stack them up in order, A, B, C, A through N, for example. And that will mean that I've got all the plays in the right order. And then you're going to sew them together. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But you stack those little quires, and that will assure that you've got all the plays in the right order. Okay. There's an additional check, especially for someone who is not completely literate. And I'll show you that on the pages of your first folio, you see buying first folio as well. And that is that at the bottom of every page that is typeset is something called a catchword. Very bottom of the page. And that same word is the first word of the column of the next page. So that's how you know when you're collating these, even if you can't read the whole play, you know that this page follows that. Okay? All right. All right. Oh my, yes, complicated. Okay. So for folio format, so this is actually the first time a folio format had been used in a publication that included plays, not exclusively plays. But in the year that Shakespeare died, 1616, Ben Jonson had printed his own works, which included plays, masques, poems, and that was really the first time a folio format had been used. And one of the reasons I reproduced the title page from that is it's beautiful, but it is quite different from the title page, of the Shakespeare First Folio. What's the difference? On the Shakespeare First Folio page, we have The author's face. That's really unusual. These are characters from the plays and the poems, but not the author's face. Oh my goodness. Okay. Ben Jonson, whose folio I just showed you, wrote one of the dedicatory verses in the Shakespeare First Folio. I'll show you that as well. He was a also famous playwright of the era, pal of Shakespeare's, mostly comic writer. So, couple of things. Maybe one year I'll do a Shakespeare conspiracy lecture. But one of the conspiracy theories, you sort of go through the logic of why would Ben Jonson, a famous playwright, have written this dedicatory verse in the First Folio if Will Shakespeare had not actually written the plays. That's one of my little pieces of evidence that Jonson is not going to write this. All right. What did Shakespeare look like? Do you all know what he looked like? You sort of know. All right. There are only two images of Shakespeare that were made while people who knew him were still alive. For sure. Yeah, there's some other paintings that are out there, and a new one has definitely been discovered in the last 24 hours. I don't know. But they're portraits that are out there, but they all kind of look like this guy, and that's why they think it's Shakespeare. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Portrait, the Folger Library, that was probably not. But there are two images for sure that were made while people who knew him were alive. Hemings and Condell engaged the engraver who made this from who knows what. Not from life, because Shakespeare was already dead 7 years, but from maybe some other medium, but certainly Hemings and Condell could have said, oh, no, he was blonde with curly hair and blue eyes. That's not. So we know that at least this passed muster with Hemings and Condell, who knew him, and I'll show you that in a minute. These are a couple pictures that I pulled off the internet of what a printing house would have looked like in a 17th century print shop. And they're actually two different kinds of presses I'm going to show you. This one, you're essentially pulling down on top of a copper plate, and that's how this engraving would have been printed. So it would have been printed somewhere other than in the place where all the text was set. And then there's another one. Okay, so these are cases with text in them, and it's from those cases that the letters are taken out, and then the type is set, of course, backwards, right? Because you're printing the mirror image. And that's where the term uppercase, lowercase comes from, is the uppercase would have, uppercase, lowercase, get it? I'm full of stuff. So the book that they're printing in this case is not a folio format, and it only has a single line of text. So they're single column of text. There are two columns on each page in the first folio. This is another one of setting the text, and you can also see the printing press. In that case, it looks more like an olive press, in which case you have to twist a screw, right? Simple machine, and that pushes the plate down onto, the paper down onto the plate and makes the impression. So that's another. All right, so here are some of the preliminaries. I'm going to show you also in the zero-line copy, but two things. One is Hemings and Condell's signature for essentially admiring their friend, showing that the reason that they put this together was to honor him and memorialize him, and also to urge you to buy the book. So, and in a great marketing strategy, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. They essentially say, you may have read the plays before. Okay, so Hamlet had been published already twice in quarto form. You may have read them already, but those were diverse, stolen, and maimed versions of the plays, and what you have in here is the real thing. And again, in The Millionaire and the Bard, I show you side by side two soliloquies, one from the first folio and one from a quarto edition, and I think you'll agree the edition that comes out of the in the first folio is far superior to the one that was published by the diverse, stolen, pirated edition. So Hemings and Condell, whoops. Okay, and that is we don't need to go over that. That's their dedicatory verse. This is the two versions of the to be or not to be soliloquy. So to be or not to be, that is the question. Nope, I don't want to read that either. But you can read that in the Millionaire and the Bard. There are actually 3 different versions of that soliloquy, and they're quite different. Simon Beale did a little piece for the BBC on the first folio, and one of the things he did was he read the first quarto edition of that speech, and it's mysterious. Usually you can listen to it, and the language, you can basically understand what it is that he's talking about, and not only are there run-out sentences with no verbs, but it's not really the same idea as the to be or not to be soliloquy. This is one of the prefatory materials in the beginning of the first folio, so there are 9 preliminaries, including the portrait, which I'll show you. And one of them is, I don't know what you would call this, it's an ersatz title page, because it says the works of William Shakespeare, which is the title, but then it's got the actors' names underneath it. And you'll notice Shakespeare is at the top, and Hemings and Condell are also listed. So they acted in the companies together. There are some other characters in there that also appear in the Millionaire and the Bard, but these 3 men knew and had acted together. This is a broadside from 1590. So first folio is published in 1623. This is a broadside from 1598, and you'll notice again Will Shakespeare, Henry Condell, and John Hemings. So they had known each other for quite some time. This was not a past acquaintance. Oh, and then this is my favorite job title of all times, is the Master of the Revels. Doesn't that sound like a great job? So where's the woman whose daughter has the book-themed wedding? Tell her you want to be the Master of the Revels.
I think so. I like that idea.
Right. So this is another one of the dedicatory verses. I pulled off the Folger website in part to show you damage to a page, and this is still a very valuable copy, but you're going to see how much nicer your copy is. Then there's the catalog, which would be something like the table of contents. So it's a list of the plays that are contained in the book, except it's missing one. Other than that, it's perfect. So there are, I believe it's 3 copies in the United States of copies that were purchased, and then the owners wrote in on the catalog that the additional play that is not included in the catalog, and that's Troilus and Cressida. Okay, so you'll see handwritten and sometimes 17th century writing. The Troilus and Cressida is in there. Okay, so innovations in publishing the first folio. Number 1 is the author on the title page. Extraordinary. Number 2 is that Hemings and Condell put act and scene divisions in, as well as some stage directions. That was new. So I'll show you. There are act and scene divisions in the first folio that do not appear in the quartos. Okay. Cymbeline, I put this page up there for a couple of reasons. One is that it's the last play in the book, and therefore its last page is one of the most rare pages, because that is the one that gets damaged. That and the portrait are the ones that get damaged most frequently. So collectors call them the grand leaves. These are the things that you look for, and a really high value copy of the first folio has that last page of Cymbeline and the portrait. See that? It's another printing press. Oh, this is what the drawing the papers in the printing house would have looked like. So you pull them off the print, the machine, and then you use something that looks a little like a pizza paddle, and you hang it on the cords in the print shop, and when they're dry, then you stack them up. And again, you want to make sure that they're going to be stacked in the right order, otherwise you're going to have pages from all these different places intermixed. Then you stack the quires, so I showed you what these little booklets, these little quires and sixes look like. You stack them up and you sew them onto a piece, usually of leather or maybe cotton thread, and I'll show you what that looks like on the binding on the copy that we're looking at today, because you can see all that. This is a 17th century binding. I'll show you the difference between that and the copy that we're going to look at today. This one is 17th century. This is probably late 19th, early 20th century rebinding. This is a little different. And the other thing that's different in this copy from the copy you're going to see is that these parts of the page are gilt on this copy. So all of the edges are gilt on this copy. That was originally done for a couple reasons. One was prestige, but the other was to protect the book from dust and, I guess, moisture as well. Okay. I do want to refer you, if you want to have the opportunity to leaf through a first folio, which you can't do today, alas, is that you can go online to the Folger website and they have a digitized copy that you can leaf through virtually, and it's pretty spectacular. Okay, 1623, the first folio goes on sale. Is registered in 1623 at the Royal Company of Stationers, which would be the guild for the printers. It's 900 pages long. We think about 750 copies were printed. If you look in The Millionaire in the Garden, I explain why I came up with that number. They're sold for about £1 if it's bound and 15 shillings if you bought it unbound. Then you could take it to your own binder and have them trim it to the size that you want and make it look like all your other books. A deposit copy was sent in sheets to 3 universities, much like we do deposit copies at the Library of Congress here. This was Elizabeth's way of populating the library of the great universities in Great Britain without having to pay for them. And it was listed under miscellaneous in the catalog of books in Frankfurt that year. So it was not exactly prestige. So what was saved? All's well that ends well, Antony and Cleopatra, as you like it, Comedy of Errors, Coriolanus, Cymbeline, first part of Henry VI, Henry VIII, Julius Caesar, King John, Macbeth, Measure for Measure, Taming of the Shrew, Tempest, Timon of Athens, 12th Night, Two Gentlemen of Verona, Winter's Tale. Okay, I'm going to skip the language that would have been lost. I did that last time. All that is language that would have been lost. The first folio becomes a fetish object. There is one. And let me talk a little bit about that. As the value, I'm about 2 minutes from finishing this one. So as the value of first folios climbs in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we have these people who are industrialists who have newfound fortunes. The people who had inherited wealth already had those copies over in the libraries in Britain. But once the big fortunes were being made in the United States, you had industrialists who had money to indulge their taste in collecting, and the prices went up. And this meant a couple things. One is that everybody was looking for a first folio, particularly people who wanted to raise money, who have them in their libraries, who didn't really care about books. I'd rather have horses than books, so sell the books. They were bringing the supply to the market. And then as prices went up, we had 2 things that happened. One is that books that were incomplete, the collectors who own them would have facsimile pages inserted to make them complete. And I'll show you one of those in here too. And then second is that they would forge copies. So we can talk a little more about that as well. Okay, so the UCI handwriting copy has several facsimile pages. I want to put a question mark after this because I couldn't find it today. I was looking and I couldn't find it, but the first catalog description of this copy says that there is a facsimile that is done by hand by a guy named John Harris, who's at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. And the Bodleian hired him to fix pages that were incomplete. So let's say you had a piece that was torn out, you repair the page, and then you have John Harris write in the printing as though it looked, and you can't tell. So good. So, but I believe you have one in that page. Right. This is another copy of the list of principal actors, but with some marginalia. Graffiti, as you wish. That is the second image of Shakespeare that was made while people that he knew was alive. That is the effigy. That's not the one. That is a copy of the effigy that is at the Trinity Chapel at Stratford upon Avon. That's Henry Folger in the lower right, and Emily Folger on the left there. But that and the title page are the only two images online. That is 82 copies of the first folio.
Wow.
And that's it. So I'm now going to show you. On the UC Irvine copy, some of the things that I've just talked about that are a result of how the copy was printed. So this is it. I mean, this is Elmo, the machine. And therefore, what you're seeing is what's underneath here. Right? Right. So you're looking at the actual copy. Oh my gosh! You understand that's unusual, right? Okay. So in California, we actually have a lot of copies of the first folio. There's Suter Library, there's UCLA, UC Irvine, several private collectors. Mills College has one. So it's not that, I mean, you don't have to travel that far. In fact, you don't have to travel at all. But if you live in Florida, there is no copy of the first folio in Florida. That we know of. I should say that. Okay. So a couple things. So one is to the reader, and that again, this is written by Ben Johnson. There are his initials there. So when you were printing, there would be no part of the letter that could go below the line because the blocks all have to be the same size, right? And then you have, whoops, are we getting green? Is it getting green?
Yeah, the color's just shifting around, not sure why.
Depending on what else. Your fingers in there go and turn blue.
Everyone else said it looks fine to me.
Okay, that's fine.
There's a color
Oh,
It's adjusting with the yeah, but it's
apologies, everybody. Our
The
copy is not
folio
green.
let it do a bit hard.
that's fine.
Well, I'll just continue and you just
Yeah,
pretend we're on Mars.
Mhm.
Here's folio. That's the first copy on Mars. All right.
I think it's just the light in here.
That might be the one.
It's the white balance.
Okay, let me, yeah. Do you know how to change that?
Move the folio so it has a chance to refocus, maybe. What if I get some white paper to put under, on top of the green mountain?
Oh, there, now it's going.
With
White paper.
Garbia Leviosa. It worked, okay. That's Harry Potter, sorry. All right, so here's the title page, which you can see the portraits in there. And only problem is it's not original to the first folio. So this is one of the few pages in this copy that are in facsimile. And in fact, you will see in the collection, when you go in there, the book that it is taken from. So there's an 1807 facsimile copy of the first folio, and this is a portrait taken from that. However, it's printed on inlaid into 17th century paper. And one of the ways that we know that it's not original to this volume is the watermark, which you might also be able to see when you go over there. So that's one.
I should point out too that
Yeah.
I think that I did a little reading that it's actually the dedication that was hand drawn.
Oh, the
The Ben Johnson one on the opposite page.
oh, this one is the one that's the hand?
Yeah.
Ah,
It's
okay.
very difficult to see, but at least from what I remember reading, that was it.
Okay, okay. And yeah, I mean, one of the things about a John Harris facsimile is I wouldn't trust myself to know. Maybe the watermark would give it away, but the Bodleian itself started making him sign the pages so they could tell the watermark. Okay, so the man was good. Okay, so On this page, I wanted you to see a couple things. One is, right, so you can see the pages are numbered. So wait a minute, if the pages are numbered, why did I have to go through this whole A and A1 and A? And the answer is they're not sequentially numbered. So I'll show you that a little bit later on, that some of the pages are out of order. So you can't use the page number as a guide for the collation. Second is, remember we talked a little bit about the process of printing from the middle of the quire. And depending on how much room you had left, let's say you misestimated how much print you were going to have and you ran out of room. Well, then you got to squish everything into the last page. So what you'll have is things that were poems that are made to look like prose. I'll show you in one of the examples, lines where the last few letters of the word go on the top, the line above it, because they're trying to save room. Well, here's an example where they had a little extra room at the end of the page, so they needed to fill it. So one of the things that they do is they put the names of the actors in there. So who are the characters that are in there? And that is really not typical. That's not in every one of the plays. But that would be kind of, and you'll notice there's some extra space here, put a little spacing in there. At the bottom of the page, and I want to move that. At the bottom of the page, they've written, you know, so they really kind of like spread that out a little bit. So in measure for measure, okay, so these are also sequentially. Yeah. Right. So those are sequentially numbered. But I want you to see, sorry. Okay, so one thing is the act and scene divisions. Again, that was Hemings and Condell. So that had not been done with the quarto editions, and that is, you can see that here. So Act 1, Scene 1. Down here, way in the corner here, at the bottom, is the word V. And the word V is the whoops. And the word V is the top. Whoops. There. Did I do that okay? So the catchwords, bottom of one page, right there. Same word at the top here. Otherwise you collated it wrong. Oops. Okay. Another mistake in how much text you have means you end up with a blank page. The most expensive part of printing the book was the value of the paper. It was extremely expensive. That's the one scene in Shakespeare in Love that drives me crazy, is Will Shakespeare crumpling up paper and throwing it away. It would have been used for something else. It would have been recycled in some way because it was very expensive. So this is an expensive, what did you do? You left a blank page. So that is a big mistake. Let me see.
Excuse me, with the rag paper,
Yep.
it could just actually be repulped and washed and reused, couldn't it?
Yes,
So-
yes. In fact, yes, it could have been. And he would likely have sold it to someone else to use it as reinforcement in binding, for example, but he wouldn't have tossed it away, right? Okay. Okay, so same issue here. Let me see if we got the right one. Yes, okay. So if you remember on the catalog page, we go from the life of King Henry VIII to, I think it's Richard III, but actually here we have the life of King Henry VIII and we go right to Troilus and Cressida, which is not in the catalog at all. So again, if you a typical collector's book, if you told them, oh, by the way, the table of contents is not right, they might not be that happy with it. First folio doesn't bother you at all, and you got an extra play that is in there as well. So Troilus and Cressida, and that was because they didn't get permission from another printer to include the play until the catalog page had already been printed. So they already printed the catalog page. They're not going to scrap those pages. They're just going to put them in there even if they're wrong. Okay. All right, and again, trying to extend the amount of text that was covered in the books. It's definitely maybe.
There we go.
Okay, here we go. So, so again, really what they're doing here is you have the epilogue for Henry VIII and the prologue for Troilus and Cressida. And again, they're trying to make the text fit into the space that they had available to them, so it's not really consistent. You know, normally the prologue would come after you have the title of the. Yeah. Okay. And then let's see. I should mention too that one of how am I doing for time?
You're quite all right.
Okay. So I should mention one of the reasons people have studied every page of the copies of the First Folio that are made to available to scholars is that we would like as complete a description as possible of the 235 known copies that are out there. So a lot of the copies had really good descriptions because they went up for auction, and the Sotheby's or Christie's wrote tremendously detailed descriptions of what the product was as they were putting them on the market. But the other thing is that it's come in very handy that there's a type A personality guy who has cataloged all these copies because on occasion someone will try to authenticate / fence a copy of a First Folio, and you'd like to know which copy is it? Is it a copy that we already know of? For example, one of the 3 or 4 that have been stolen, and is somebody bringing it? So, I mean, if you get, you know, Van Gogh's The Lilies that come into for an art appraiser, they know exactly what it is and exactly where it came from. With the First Folio, you have a choice. It's one out of, let's say, 235 known copies. Can we say specifically that it is a particular copy? And the answer is, in some cases, yes, because we have such detailed descriptions of what is in the books that we can narrow it down. All right, so to begin with, and I'll show you this last, the cover, the color, the material, the ornament. So you can even see on the turnovers here, the leather that is turned around the binding here. We know that is gilt, and it's got these particular tools in it that somebody can describe. Franklin Mallory can describe extremely well. Are the pages gilt? What are the dimensions of the page? Are there specific idiosyncratic, for example, smudges on them? And this is all cataloged. So the third edition of Anthony West's catalog of these books contains things like, okay, on page, oh, that's another one to show you. There are no page numbers here. But they would say, you know, on this page, there's a smudge over, you know, somebody's page and so on and so forth. I do want to show you some couple other nice things here. One is the printer's ornament. It's at the bottom there, which I think is quite lovely. And that one's a nice crisp version of it. Some of them are a little duller than that, depending on whether they over-inked it. And then I also want to find one more thing. Oh. Okay. So remember, I don't want to move this over to you. There we go, okay. Yikes. Thank you. So one of the things that I showed you was you would put these signatures with the letters and the numbers, and that would help you with the collation. And there's your signature right there. So it says BB3, which this is pretty close to the end of the book. Thanks. This is pretty close to the end of the book, so you would have had choir A, B, C, all the way through, I think it's N, I've forgotten, but I think it's N. And then they start over with AA, BB, so this is BB3, which means on the next page, oops, no, on the previous page, you have BB2, and on the
And BB.
page before that, BB. But after BB3, you don't have another signature. Why not? Because if you got them in the right order, only the first three matter, and the rest of them are going to be in the right order.
Right.
Right? Makes sense. Okay. And then the last idiosyncratic thing I want to show you here. Oh no. One is owners were not always really careful with their copies. So we have lots of copies that have things like jam stains, tobacco burns. The Samuel Johnson copy had flakes of pastry in it. He was a strawberry jam man. In this case, I don't know how well you can see that. Someone left a pair of scissors inside the book. How about that?
Fire scissors anywhere.
Yeah, and they close the book, and so you've got the impression from both sides. This will make the hair on the back of your head stand up. There's a copy at the Folger that I saw somebody who was looking through one, and it had on one page the rust stain, but on the other page not. And as it turns out, the other page was a facsimile. However, the Folgers had also bought a fragment of a copy from a dealer in London. And when they went through the fragments, found the other page. So when someone asks you why do you need 82 copies and all these fragments and all these, it's for that. Yeah, it's for that. So here you can see, there are a couple I've seen also, these are scissors, but I've also seen a couple that had spectacles or knives. There's also a copy that was stolen from the Durham University Library in England that had, to me it looks like a piece of glass was left in the book and then closed. And then, so now you have an impression that's, let's say, 6 pages deep, but of a really strange size. And that actually turns out to be the piece of information that cinched it that the copy that was brought into the Folger Library in 2008 for authentication was the one that had been stolen from Durham because they had a picture of this little, isn't that cool? That is cool. Okay, one last thing here. Let's see. No, I'm going to skip that, but I'm going to show you the binding. So, among other things that is an identifier of a copy is what is the material? This is called Morocco. What is the color? You've got these ornaments, decorations on the corners, and those can be described. And then remember I showed you the quires being sewn onto strips. You'll be able to see what that results in. Oops, I don't know if you can really see that. Yeah, you can. These little bands that are raised. Okay. And then this one's got a particularly lovely binding. So the name on there. And these are all raised. This is raised where those have been sewn on.
I hear murmuring behind me, there's someone saying, is that the original binding? And I know
Oh,
you
it
can
is
answer that
not.
question.
It is, well, it's possible it was unbound until the 19th century, but unlikely. So this is a late 19th century, early 20th century binding, which is, it's a beautiful binding. But most of them have been recovered. There are not that many copies that have the original 17th century binding. I think there are 3 at the Folger and there's 1 at the bottom. And that's it. That's it. Especially want to thank UC Irvine Library and everybody who made this happen, Julia and John and everybody else that, Derek, that I could enjoy handling your copy. So thank you. Thank you.